They laughed because she wasn't chopping wood. She was hauling stones, tons of them. No one believed rocks could save you in a Montana winter. By February, the people who mocked her were sleeping on those same stones, trying to stay alive. On the frontier, people trusted what they could see. Smoke meant warmth. Wood meant safety. Anything else felt like a gamble you couldn't afford. Most winters rewarded conformity. Do what everyone else does, and you might survive. Do something different, and you'd better be right. That's why this story unsettled an entire settlement. Because the solution didn't look strong, it didn't look efficient, and it didn't look like survival at all. What followed wasn't just a clever build. It was a moment where certainty collapsed, and people had to confront the idea that tradition had limits. Before you keep watching, take 1 second and answer this in the comments. If you lived back then, would you trust what everyone already does, or try something unproven to survive? Stay with the story, because by the end, you'll understand why laughter stopped long before the snow did. The setup that made everyone laugh. Ingrid's chimney looked ordinary from the outside, a tall stone column rising nearly 14 feet above the cabin roof, sending smoke into the Montana sky, just like every other home along Stillwater Creek. Nothing about it suggested innovation or rebellion, but what no one expected was what lay beneath the cabin floor. 6 feet underground, directly below the firebox, Ingrid had dug a second foundation by hand. It was a stone-lined chamber, nearly 12 feet long. Carefully packed with river rock, she hauled herself and mortared slowly over weeks. Neighbors watched and shook their heads. They said she was wasting strength she could not afford to lose. One man warned she would freeze digging holes instead of stacking firewood. Another claimed she was burning fuel trying to heat dirt. They all agreed on one principle they believed unbreakable. Heat rises. You do not fight nature. Ingrid did not argue or explain. She simply worked, knowing she was not trying to heat air at all. She was preparing a place to store heat, not chase it. The chimney trick. No one expected. The laughter grew louder when word spread about what Ingrid had done to the chimney itself. Yes, smoke still rose and exited the cabin as expected, but before it escaped, something unusual happened inside the stonework. Ingrid had split the flue 4 feet above the firebox, redirecting the hottest gases downward into the underground stone chamber. The path twisted deliberately through dense river rock before slowly rejoining the main chimney and venting outside. By the time smoke finally left the cabin, most of its heat had already been absorbed by stone. To her neighbors, this looked absurd and backward. But Ingrid knew this idea was ancient. Romans used similar systems in bathhouses. Koreans warmed homes through heated floors. Northern Europeans built massive tile stoves around thermal mass. On the Montana frontier, however, knowledge without familiarity looked like madness, and tradition without understanding felt safer than innovation. The first signs. Something was different. By mid-December, the jokes began to fade. Ingrid's cabin was warmer at dawn than it had ever been in previous winters. There was no frost creeping across the interior walls. No desperate midnight feeding of the fire. Instead of burning small fires all day, Ingrid burned hot fires twice daily. The stone chamber absorbed the heat like a battery and released it slowly through the night. While neighbors woke to ice forming in water buckets and stiff boots by the door, her cabin stayed comfortably above 60 degrees. The warmth felt steady rather than sharp, coming from floors and walls instead of blasting from iron. Still, skepticism lingered. One warm stretch meant nothing. Winter had not yet shown its teeth. Everyone in the valley knew the real test was still ahead, and when it came, it would not be gentle. When winter finally arrived. 2 days before Christmas, the storm arrived without mercy. Temperatures dropped more than 20 degrees in a single afternoon. Wind drove snow sideways across the valley and erased visibility. Cabins everywhere burned through wood at terrifying speed. Men fed stoves every 2 hours and still could not keep water from freezing. Children coughed through the night as cold air settled into their lungs. Fingers went numb while reloading fireboxes in the dark. Inside Ingrid's cabin, the difference was startling. She slept through the night with a single blanket. The temperature barely dipped below the high 50s. The floor radiated warmth. The walls held heat. Even after the fire burned down to coals, the cabin stayed alive. Then, in the middle of that frozen silence, someone knocked on her door. The moment everything changed. Sarah Brennan arrived at dawn, breathless and shaking, carrying her 4-year-old son. He could not breathe properly. The cold had settled deep into his chest. Their stove burned constantly, yet the cabin air remained bitter and thin. Ingrid did not hesitate. She brought the child inside and laid him on a bed placed directly above the hottest section of stone beneath the floor. She wrapped him in dry blankets and let the stored heat do its work. Within minutes, his breathing slowed. Within an hour, his fever broke. The warmth was not just in the air. It came from the floor, the walls, the space itself. By the second day of the storm, 7 more people crowded into Ingrid's small cabin. They were not guests. They were survivors. While others ran out of wood, her pile shrank slowly, deliberately, predictably, from ridicule to replication. When the storm finally broke, no one laughed anymore. Men who once doubted her now measured the flue with careful hands. They asked about stone density, chamber depth, airflow paths. Some offered labor, others brought tools. By spring, several cabins across the settlement were being excavated. The following winter, families using underground thermal mass systems burned half the wood and slept through the night without fear. Children stayed healthier. Hands no longer froze during midnight stove reloads. What began as ridicule turned into repetition. A census taker later noted the settlement's unusually advanced heating systems and remarkably low fuel use. He recommended the design for military forts. Nothing came of it. Convenience eventually replaced ingenuity. But the knowledge survived quietly, passed from parent to child, cabin to cabin, without ever needing permission. What the cabin really proved. Ingrid did not invent anything new. She remembered what others had forgotten. She carried knowledge from a place where winter demanded respect, where heat was not chased, but stored, where survival depended on understanding how materials behaved, rather than how fiercely fires burned. Her system worked because it was built on physics older than the country itself. Heat radiates. Stone holds warmth. Stored energy lasts longer than open flame. When winter arrived and tested everything, the system did not fail. People did. And in that failure, the cabin revealed a quiet truth. Progress is not always about new ideas. Sometimes it is about remembering the ones that already worked. They laughed because tradition felt safer than thinking. Because copying what everyone else did felt less risky than being wrong alone. But winter doesn't care what feels safe. It only responds to what works. Ingrid didn't survive by burning more. She survived by understanding more. And once that truth revealed itself, laughter turned into measurement, and certainty quietly changed sides. Before you leave, take a moment. Comment the part of this story that surprised you the most, the detail that made you pause. And if stories like this make you question what you've always been told works, subscribe. Not for instructions, not for hacks,